Hello, everyone, and welcome to tonight's Garden Suite panel discussion. I'm Craig Brace, one of the co-founders of Lanescape. And for anyone who doesn't know, Lanescape was founded in 2014 to advocate for an as-of-right laneway suite policy right here in Toronto. Since that policy was enacted in 2018, we've been designing and building laneway suites and continuing our stewardship of the policy by providing information on how they affect our properties and neighborhoods. This includes free property reports, webinars, and panel discussions like the one you're about to see. Our company worked for 4 years advocating for a laneway suite policy, and it required a huge amount of trailblazing by early adopters, politicians, and dozens of departments in City Hall, including the panelists here tonight. But Toronto is a different place than it was in 2014. Since then, our population has increased by over 100,000 people, and the price of an average home has doubled from $500,000 to a little over $1 million. That spark that ignited the laneway housing movement has led to an inferno of initiatives that will be rethinking the way we use our neighborhoods, including a broad range of missing middle housing solutions, starting with garden suites. So before we introduce the panelists, we'll do a really quick introduction as to what is a garden suite. Like a laneway suite, a garden suite functions as a separate secondary housing unit located in a rear yard, detached from the main house. Unlike a laneway suite, a garden suite is not next to a public lane and could instead be next to other yards, a flanking street, a private lane, or a park or other uses. Garden suites are intended to be non-severable, which means they cannot be turned into a separate property from the main house. They remain under the same ownership and are serviced with water, sewer, and other utilities through connection to the main house itself. They're intended for use as rental housing, accommodating loved ones, or for aging in place. This policy is very exciting because it has the potential to affect significantly more properties than the laneway policy does. Where there are only tens of thousands of laneway properties in Toronto, they tend to be in the core of the city. Garden suites could affect hundreds of thousands of properties in all parts of Toronto. This could be a big difference maker in expanding the missing middle and unlocking the yellow belt. And what's even more exciting is that where our company took 4 years to steward a laneway policy, the group we're about to speak to tonight will do the same for garden suites in only 1 year. So we think that's really commendable. We're interested to hear what they say tonight. So I'd like to welcome them to the panel, and if they could turn on their videos, we can meet them all in person. Please welcome Graig Uens, Allison Reid, and David Driedger, two of which are here presently. Hi, David. Hi, Allison. If you could unmute yourselves too, we'd love to hear what you have to say.
Hi, Craig.
Hi, Allison.
Nice to meet you.
Thanks so much for joining us. And I know Graig is putting his kid to bed. And with this type of housing, it's really about putting family first. So it makes sense the panel would have the same priorities.
Definitely.
So my first question is, I just want to know a little bit more about your team, how you operate within the planning department and within the Expanding Housing Options Initiative. So if one of you could kind of tell us how that all works, we'd love to know more.
Sure. I'll go ahead then. So within the Expanding Housing Options, there's a number of different teams. So the EHON initiative is the broader kind of umbrella that all these different initiatives fall under, which is looking at just providing more options within neighborhoods. And each team has staff from planning department, and it's a wide variety of staff within the planning department. I'm in community planning, so I typically, my day-to-day work is normally reviewing development applications, holding community meetings, and working on that type of specific development. But my co-lead is Allison Reid, and we also have a team of about 6 other planners just on our garden suites team, which include people from heritage planning, urban design, graphics, and a variety of other community planners and people within city planning. And then from there, we connect in with all the other city divisions that help us to work through any kind of issues or hurdles that we need to get through to try and bring forward a effective policy for garden suites.
That's great. And just where did you get your marching orders? Like, what was the impetus for garden suites coming to Toronto? if maybe Allison or Greg, if one of you would like to take this.
I don't know, Greg, you can speak up too. Greg's really leading the overall EHON initiative, project managing that. But in terms of this specific project for garden suites, it's twofold. So the changes to the Planning Act brought forward by the province has asked all municipalities across Ontario to look at bringing in regulations for detached accessory dwelling units, in addition to residential permissions within neighborhoods, specifically related to detached, semi-detached, and row house or townhouse type residential areas. So that's kind of a provincial mandate, I guess. And then specifically within the EHON initiative, the garden suites is really just an extension of the work already begun with the accessory dwelling units through the Laneway initiative, and really looking at the rest of the opportunities, as you had mentioned, Craig, to bring detached secondary suites to other residential properties across the city that don't have a lane.
Yeah, this seems like a very logical progression from Laneway Suites. But, it kind of sounds like, based on provincial policy, is this something that's inevitable?
Definitely, it's a requirement. Everyone has to have a policy. Every municipality has to bring forward a policy to meet the Planning Act requirement. Different municipalities have taken different approaches. They've been more restrictive in some cases, and only certain lot sizes would be eligible for a detached unit. But other municipalities, like the approach that we're taking here, are trying to make it available to as many residential properties across the city as possible.
I definitely want to learn more about your approach, because I think many of the people listening here tonight were really thrilled with the public events you've held so far. It seems like you're taking a very open and public first approach to creating policy here. Is that different than how the planning department has historically operated?
I don't know if it's quite different, but I think for such a study that is diving into an area of the city that we maybe not haven't in the past seen this type of development in, we're at overall, I think, a very exciting time in terms of just looking at all the options that we can allow for in neighborhoods. And that's, I think, the excitement around the entire EHON initiative, that there's a lot of interesting things and interesting housing options that we're able to work on and introduce, and trying to do that in a sensitive way that acknowledges that neighborhoods bring something really interesting to the city, as low-rise neighborhoods, as areas with lots of green space. And in order to do that effectively, trying to hear from as many voices as possible, and ensuring that they're heard, and that where possible we address issues or listen to concerns, listen to the excitement that people have, the reasons for why people want to have these garden suites. I think that's very helpful in our consultation process to make sure that we have kind of as open a dialogue as we can have to bring forward effective policy. As Allison said, some municipalities are taking a variety of different approaches, and at the end of the day, we want to preserve certain key aspects of neighborhoods, mature trees, green space. At the same time, we also want to allow for actual usable options for homes, for households that are of different makeups, and give a new option for this. So that's why we chose that kind of the garden suites name. We could have chosen coach houses or detached accessory dwelling units, but that didn't sound as exciting. So we chose garden suites purposely just for that idea of the garden and the suite, and trying to make that balance. I think that all just comes to listening to people and trying to work with all the different voices that come forward with garden suites.
Well, I don't know who it was in your department that came up with the name Changing Lanes for the Laneway policy. They knocked it out of the park on that one. And I agree that Garden Suites is a very marketable name for this. But in spite of that very flowery name, pun intended, what are you hearing from residents, especially in the periphery of the city, where they might not be used to intensification or multiple units on a single property?
I would say overwhelmingly from individual residents reaching out to us, we're hearing a lot of excitement and support, and that's across the entire city. Actually, I would say almost more so from the inner and even outer suburbs. We're hearing from people who are interested to build a garden suite on their property, and for a whole variety of different reasons, but many of the common ones that you would expect. But yeah, actually, I don't think surprisingly, but just really a lot of the residents reaching out are really keen to do it right away, and are interested to know if the rules are already in place and if they can either convert something they already have or work towards building something new on their properties. And I think, to a certain extent, it's not so surprising in a way, because a lot of the inner and outer suburbs have larger lots, and there is some potential, or perhaps even a greater potential, to have a garden suite type unit on those lots while still maintaining that soft landscaped character, the tree canopy, and that separation from neighbors and things because of the larger, more generous lot sizes.
I believe that the majority of what you're hearing is positive, but I attended the public meetings and I know not all the comments were positive. But I also know a lot of the comments I heard were just classic NIMBYism that didn't really have a lot of substance to the objection to the idea. It was just general opposition to any change. However, I'm interested to hear, because we all saw a draft policy, which I'll dive into in a minute here. What are the things you've been hearing that sort of inspired you to change the early policy that we saw shared that will influence what we see when this is done?
I think we're in that process now. So we actually haven't received a significant amount of feedback yet. We have another round of consultation that we're planning for early September into early October, where we can really reach back out on the draft rules that we prepared and presented to Planning and Housing Committee. I think I would say it's more questions rather than really strong responses yet that we've been receiving from people. I think there's some desire for additional clarification. We have plans to present and prepare some demonstrations to help people visualize the rules, so that may solicit more response and reaction once we're able to bring those communications forward in the next round of consultation that we're planning.
Does that mean you're actually going to build like a test project or something like that?
Not physically, that's not the city's plan at this point, but digitally, yes.
Okay.
Yeah,
that's
so
pretty good.
The case study areas and the sort of typical or some different lot sizes, we were preparing some demonstrations presently that we can take to the broader community for people to see what the draft rules look like when applied.
And is the plan that in the fall, when you have that second round of outreach, you'll be presenting sort of the visualizations of what the policy looks like to get feedback based on that?
Exactly.
And is that going to be like another kind of webinar or public meeting type thing, like the first round?
We have a couple of different things that we're just finalizing right now, but one of which was actually an idea that we would maybe use our website platform to provide something that people could view at their leisure. So not just a particular event, but to try to put something up ahead of a consultation event so that people could have time to review and prepare some comments and questions ahead of any sort of larger forum discussion.
Okay, so I'm interested to know, we should probably run through what the first draft of the policy looked like in terms of the performance standards. Can one of you kind of give us like a Coles Notes of the size and the shape of what these things are going to be? And I have a visualization I can share that we created that may or may not be right. So you can tell me if this is bang on or if it's wrong.
I could start just with one sort of preface to this, and then I don't know, David, not to put you on the spot, but maybe you could walk through the specifics. But But the preface
The whole point of this is to put you three on the spot, so don't hold back, Allison.
I wanted to just preface with that we unlike or not unlike laneway suites, but for garden suites, one of the key starting points in our methodology for developing the standards is working from the ancillary building and structure portion of the existing bylaw. So because there's already an as of right permission that's granted to a property for an ancillary structure in the bylaw today, we thought that was the most appropriate place to begin. And then also looking at a whole number of additional performance standards that are in the bylaw around soft landscape, total site coverage, et cetera, and really working within that framework as our starting point. And then starting to think about how, because it now would have a living environment in it, how do we make the living environment a high quality place? And then also, how do we mitigate any additional impact associated with the fact that there will be somebody living in it versus just the storage of, a vehicle or a shed or something like that, which is pretty passive. So that I just wanted to kind of preface that was our starting point, and not starting, for instance, from the laneway bylaw, just because we don't have a laneway and we don't have that kind of contiguous street wall type condition along a laneway, or that expectation of kind of garages all in a row. The ancillary bylaw really speaks to structures could be placed in many different locations in a rear yard. So we really felt it was important to begin from that part of the bylaw when we started to develop the standards.
Interesting. And so, the draft bylaw, correct me if I'm wrong on these stats, but it allowed for a 6-meter building height, which meant we're talking about a 2-story structure here. That does go a couple meters above the current allowable height of things like garages. Understanding that these things are in flux and bound to change, it is the idea that, the goal of this is to provide as much above grade space as possible so we can have livable units, or are we potentially going to walk that back? Like, talk to us about how you landed on the height and the scale of what these are going to be.
So I think right now we wanted to land on an envelope that a garden suite could be designed to fit within, not necessarily that, sort of even these multifaceted shapes that you're showing here. The expectation is this would not be the design of the garden suite.
But you know how people work, right? Like, if you give them an envelope, they're going to take every cubic inch of
it. Fair enough. I think the question about 6 meters, though, just to answer that specifically. So yes, the base bylaw starts at a 4-meter height, or allows up to 4 meters in height. Laneways allows 6. Part of where we ended up to contemplate an additional 2 meters was, if it could be appropriately accommodated on a site, then would it be reasonable to allow it to be taller? And I think that was kind of where we're coming at it, with the idea that if the property or if the site was large enough and it had enough space to provide separation, et cetera, could additional height and potentially an additional story or a lofted space be accommodated in the suite to your point, add some additional living space to the suite. So I think that's where we've come to thus far in trying to see if we could provide some parameters to allow that additional 2 meters in height, but being, I think, somewhat cautious about it because, again, we don't have the laneway. The impact of that additional height would be felt in a different way than it is in a laneway context.
Yeah, I think that part of it was kind of splitting hairs in some ways, but I think it's starting off that the base, the way we viewed it, I think was more of the base was 4 meters in height. And that's kind of where your starting point is. So you can have a 4-meter garden suite in the rear yard. We want the majority of the rear yard to be open space to try and maintain some of that openness that you feel within neighborhoods. And then you can fill up kind of the rest with a garden suite. And then if you wanted to have that additional height, that's where we started putting in some of those kind of angular planes just to deal with pushing it away from the neighbors, to address some of those concerns about kind of having a 6-meter wall right next to the property line and pushing it a bit farther from the main dwelling so that you had a bit more separation as you have these kind of 2-story structures facing each other then. So, well, it does kind of permit that 6 meters. I think in our heads, we started with 4 meters, and I look at, we're starting to now play with these lot studies and work through what actually could be designed within the space. Does this create a functional unit? On a smaller lot like the 15-foot lot you have shown there, it might be that someone chooses not to build a 6-meter tall building and not take advantage of the additional height, because then they don't have to set it back as far from the main dwelling. They can take advantage of that 5-meter separation. And that might also work for some people that are looking for an accessible unit for that aging in place, and for whatever other needs that someone might have for accessibility reasons, wanting that 1-story unit. And we haven't put any stories specifically onto it. We've always kind of spoken in height, and while we know that most people are probably going to do slab on grade because of cost and just ease of doing that, someone could get 2 stories within that 4-meter height if they chose to put a basement in or kind of a sunken first floor. And I think we're excited to hear from individuals such as yourself through the kind of the next process of people are excited to build them. Is this going to work for them? Is this what they're looking to build? Especially people that are wanting to live in a garden suite. How is this actually working? And making sure that we have a very successful program, because we want to ensure that, again, that garden in the suite, we want to preserve that garden. We want to work with preserving trees. We want to preserve green space. But at the end of the day, we also want to make sure that it produces really great new living options for the city that haven't been there before for a variety of households.
Just want to chime in for 1 second, Craig. I'm just noticing as I'm looking here, I think there is one error in this visualization of the angular planes. I thought I should just mention. And I think it's where you're taking the rear angular plane, or how you're applying the rear angular plane, because it's really cutting off a lot of the back portion of the suite. And I'm not quite sure, but if this, it looks to me as though you may be taking the angular plane at the line of the building, but the rear angular plane is actually measured at a height of 2 meters at the property line. So that's a distinction there that's maybe a little bit different than what you're showing in the diagram. So the impact of that angular plane would actually be much, much less than what you're demonstrating here, I think.
Well, that's good to know. And this is part of your unenviable position, is that the shape that results of, so many angular planes results in fairly complex geometry. It's obviously going to be difficult for people to wrap their heads around, which is in direct defiance to the idea of this being something that's accessible to everyday homeowners at, low costs. So when you're considering that, and I'll just take my graphic down since it's blatantly wrong, the staff who prepared that will get a performance review tomorrow. Don't worry about that. But no, how are we going to make sure that this policy is something that is simple to construct, and has a simple performance standard behind it that applies equally to a postage stamp lot in Leslieville and a 75-foot wide lot in Scarborough? How is that even possible?
I think that's the I'll say the fun part of the job in many ways. And I think this is actually a great example of why we wanted to take the next step for our consultation, is putting together some more graphics and visualizations to allow for a better understanding of what the bylaw means. And also sometimes just the wording we use, we get fairly technical at times, and trying to bring it in a plain language way that makes it easier to access. But at the end of the day, at the end of the process, with whatever rules we've put forward, we do want to work very diligently at the implementation process and making sure that someone doesn't have to go to a copy of the zoning bylaw and start reading through the zoning bylaw to try and determine what they can build on their lot. And I think that's where some of our graphics that we're trying to put together for the next round of consultation are going to be helpful with. but also just trying to, at the end of the day, have, even if it's a one-page kind of printout or one page on a website where you go and without having to scroll through something, you can get the basic information and clearly understand how this would apply to a site, a property, and whether you can accommodate something on your property and set those expectations. I think that's a very important part, so that people can really know what they can do on their property and not have to just, read a bylaw, because I don't want to have to read through a bylaw myself half the time anyway. And I think that was even lessons learned with looking at other jurisdictions and what they're doing and having to try and figure out what are they doing and having to read through their own bylaws. And I'm like, okay, I don't even understand what this is trying to tell me right now. I think communication is a huge part of that.
Well, you better work fast on those, because people definitely took a screenshot of that inaccurate diagram I just showed. So it'll be on Marty Steele's newsletter in the morning. We better get out and cure the fake news.
I think one of the things that we've done well lately with some of the more common standards in the bylaws have diagrams and things on the city's website to help people understand what we're talking about, and just make the applicability very clear. As we work through the expanding housing options in neighborhoods, work programs, and different types of missing middle housing present new opportunities around the city, I think it's worth looking at some kind of a guide, or explaining to people who are going to be pursuing these, who are primarily people who live in neighborhoods who may not have a lot of experience with bylaws and the committee of adjustment or building permit process, to get an understanding of how maybe they could do one of these things on their property. I think that'll be an important step in this process.
I couldn't agree more. And so to that end, are we going to end up with a policy here that will apply, be the same performance standard in the core as well as the periphery? Or are we looking at something that changes depending on the geography of the city?
Yeah, it will be the same bylaw, but the outcome won't be the same. The outcome of applying the bylaw, and this is part of I guess a little bit of the challenge of kind of the complexity of the bylaw, is that what we were trying to do is to create something that's scalable and responds to the size of the backyard, or the scale of the available space, I guess, within the rear yard. And so if you have a big lot downtown, or you have a big lot far away from downtown, it doesn't matter. That your lot size and the space available is really what's kind of the permission is working around. And if you have a small lot, the same goes. Your garden suite would be smaller to respond to the size of the lot, and the other principles around maintaining soft landscaped area, tree planting opportunity, as well as outdoor amenity associated with the grade related living. So the principles, we're testing them across a variety of different geographies and locations, and lot patterns do have some similarities in certain parts of the city just based on the era of subdivision, for example. But the idea is that the bylaw would be one bylaw for the whole city, but it would kind of, the size of the garden suite or the placement on the lot would kind of scale and change in response to the specific lot geometry available. And so there's kind of an equity to that approach, we felt that it's really about allowing the different residential lots to accommodate a suite that fits their property regardless of where they might be in the city.
It's music to my ears. As an architect, one of the greatest frustrations is, every law looks the same, but if it's RM or RS or RD or R, it's a completely different outcome. So having a universal standard that is actually comprehensible across the whole city, I think is going to really help homeowners get access to this policy. In terms of where it will apply, is there any thought of starting a pilot area first, or like the Lanescape policy, is this something that's going to be enacted across the entire city at once? Or is that still to be determined?
No, I mean, right now we're looking at everywhere, and again, also applying sort of an equity perspective, a residential property in one part of the city really should have the same right to add another suite to their property as anywhere else. And so I think, as I had mentioned at the beginning, a lot of the interest has actually been coming from areas outside of the downtown. So, to sort of move on a notion to exclude those areas would kind of be counter intuitive to sort of what we're hearing from residents and community members across the city and people interested in bringing this type of housing. And if anything, like some of those areas are really not served by a diversity of housing options. They tend to be quite singular in, whether it's single detached, maybe sometimes semis, sometimes townhouses, but often it's very monolithic in the housing choices that are available in those, mid-century and later subdivisions. So, again, bringing another housing option perhaps is even more of a priority in the newer portions of the city versus the older parts of the city.
Interesting.
We definitely get a lot of go
Sorry,
ahead.
David, go ahead.
I was just saying that we get a lot of calls. I get multiple calls every day from people excited about garden suites and just asking about can their property accommodate one. And there are a vast number of them that are just saying, please don't let this be a downtown centric policy. They live in Scarborough, they live in Etobicoke, they live in North Toronto somewhere, and they're very excited for it for a variety of different reasons, but they really are wanting to see this implemented citywide.
And can I get the three of you to say on record right now that you will stand up and fight against the ABC Residents Association from being excluded from this policy? I'm just kidding. I'll talk to Councillor Wong-Tam about that. So, I mean, this all sounds pretty logical and exciting. Can you give us a timeline on, we know it sounds like there's going to be more outreach in the fall. Is the plan to put this in front of council this year, or what's the current track that you're on?
The plan is that we'd like to have this done and a final report to Planning and Housing Committee this year. The idea being if we can get it to Planning and Housing Committee this year, then by early 2022, people could be coming in and applying for building permits and moving forward with projects. Whether that comes to reality, we want to also make sure that we aren't rushing something out just to get it out. As excited as we are, and as much as we are very excited about the project overall, we want to make sure that we have appropriately listened and addressed issues that come up, and that we put out a policy that is workable and that will be effective at the end of the day.
Great. So, and the process is that it goes to Planning and Housing first, and assuming they approve it, then it would go to City Council. Is that correct?
Yes. So then we go to City Council, after Planning and Housing Committee. Then that would be when City Council would actually make the final decision on the recommendations that we'll put forward.
What's the time gap typically between those two stall points?
It's typically about a month, but it really depends on just kind of the timing of various meetings, but normally less than a month between.
Great. Well, and when that starts to happen, I mean, I'm sure many of the people listening tonight will get engaged to write letters to the councillors. In the meantime, what can we do to help your team hear our voices and make sure we get the best policy out of this?
I mean, definitely from a design perspective, I'm sure there's industry professionals in the virtual room tonight, and we encourage anyone to reach out to try out the draft rules, reach out if they have questions about what we mean by something, if it's not clear. I'm all for crowdsourcing demonstrations as well as the work that we're doing. People trying out on specific lots that they might have been approached about. The more people kind of putting it to the preliminary test, the better, because then we can kind of have a bit of a workshopping process to kind of make sure we've thought about every possible condition, or at least as many as possible, so that we're not finding out later, triggering minor variance processes and things which obviously can add time and effort to a project. So the more kind of input we can receive from people who might be delivering this product, it's also really helpful to us.
And that would be directly to David and Allison, is that right?
Yes, and we can share it with our broader team. So, even if anyone wants to send a SketchUp model, we have, we're doing that too. So I won't say no if anybody wants to share their own visualizations or their own ideas.
Well, I definitely need your help with our visualizations, Allison, so expect a call from me on Monday. So
no problem.
To wrap this up, I want to put a warm and fuzzy feel into this and kind of understand what each of you has invested in this personally to some degree. One thing that I found really rewarding about working on Laneway Suites over especially the last year is how adaptive they've been to housing needs in our neighborhoods, especially as it relates to COVID. Like, I've been blown away by how Laneway Suites have become not just rental apartments, but they become multi-generational living opportunities, work from home opportunities, and often combinations thereof. Can each of you kind of give me an idea about what you're most excited about with respect to garden suites? And maybe let's start with Graig, just to pick someone. Put you on the spot.
No problem. I'm excited about garden suites because, like you said, I've seen what has happened since people have been able to build laneway suites in the city. And like you said, there have been people using them for all sorts of different household situations, for rental accommodation. A bunch of different kinds of suites have been built. We've had, I think there have been about 240 building permit applications submitted for laneway suites since the bylaw was enacted. And that number increases every year. So as these are built, people notice them and they say, hey, maybe I can do that. And, I get, like David said earlier, I've gotten calls just about every single day since that bylaw was enacted by people asking if they can build a suite or asking specifics about it. And you hear people's stories a lot of the time about, I'm trying to do this. So, because my father lives with us and I want to give him a space of his own, or, my kids might live there one day before they move out of the house. And just, hearing how people are going to use the additional living space to accommodate different situations is fantastic. And I think it's a sort of a new type of housing that is very much needed in areas like a lot of the city's neighborhoods, where it can be very challenging to find a place to live. You may be able to afford to rent a garden suite, but you can't afford to buy or rent an entire house. And maybe it doesn't work for you to live in a basement apartment because of your family situation. So these provide an additional housing option in an area that, as we know, is a desirable place to live in the city. So I'm excited. I think it's, like you said, a logical progression of what we saw with laneway suites. And I'm very excited about this work. And Allison and David have done fantastic work in, putting this together as quickly as they have, bringing it out to the public. And it's, the laneway suite stuff moved fairly quick. And part of that was because the response we got from people was so positive. And I think that's the case here as well. From what I've heard, there have been very positive comments, and where they aren't positive, they're often constructive, because now people understand what it's like to have a backyard house. They're getting built in the city. So it's, I'm optimistic about what's going to happen going forward. And I think, there's been great progress to date. I'm excited.
Me too. It's a golden age for housing in Toronto right now, most notably because of the work your team is doing. Allison, can you envision yourself living in a garden suite one day? Is that what gets you through these long days in the office?
I want to move there right now. I have a young family. It's been a long COVID isolation, let's just say. I wish I had that suite I could retreat to. I think for me too, there's a couple of things. I spoke to it a little bit just about when I was talking a bit about the equity or sort of the decision making about bringing it across the city. I think it offers an opportunity to present some gradual change to parts of the city that may otherwise remain somewhat stagnant or unchanged. And with people wanting to age in place in their neighborhoods. And right now, unless there's an avenue and, an opportunity for a mid-rise building to go in nearby, for somebody to have a grade-related option that could bring some accessible small-scale dwelling units into a neighborhood area, I think it's really exciting, and it brings a range of housing choice opportunity to communities across the entire city. And I think those two things are quite exciting and interesting to me, because it's not just focused, like David and I, our day-to-day work is really focused on the intensive growth areas of the city and the places that are receiving a lot of intense investment and change. And this is a kind of more gradual and smaller scale change on an incremental level, but it has the ability to affect and bring options to people in many more places across the whole city. So I think that's interesting and kind of exciting. The one other thing that really has motivated me on this project is really around the notion of the garden portion. We haven't talked much about it today. We've talked a lot about the suite portion. And I think it's this kind of inherent tension that we've all been grappling with on this project. And we haven't been moving rapidly, in a sense, because we've been very careful and cautious, because we are concerned, or we don't take lightly this notion of adding kind of an additional house or a small scale house on a property without giving consideration to the immense tree canopy across the neighborhoods of the city of Toronto. It's a huge asset. And so again, we really, I see it as like an exciting opportunity to try to work through. It's a challenge because we want to make sure that at the end of the day, we can create something that can coexist together with that green and soft landscaped and heavily tree canopied portions of our city that we have, and we really do need to cherish, because it is something actually quite definitive about Toronto. People comment about it. They look down from the CN Tower, they look down from the taller buildings, and the urban forest is quite an amazing asset of the city, and a huge part of it is in the private landscapes of residential properties. So I think, to me, it's actually an exciting portion of the project, really puzzling through and trying to figure out how we can achieve that balance between the suite and the garden.
Yeah, that's a great point. It's so easy to get bogged down in the house itself, but the society it supports and the nature that surrounds it is so important. What about yourself, David? And if you want to conclude by also telling us how we can stay involved with your efforts, that'd be a great sign-off point from you all.
Sounds great. I'd have to echo everything that Graig and Allison said. Just listening to the people that are excited about it, hearing how it has the potential to have such a great impact and a positive impact on the livability of their properties, their living situation. I think that Garden Suites has just a great potential for creating options for a variety of households and household needs that we just don't see in the city right now, or don't have housing options for those needs. So I think that's a very exciting part of it. Even just listening to people who are expressing their concerns. People are passionate about their neighborhoods, and understandably so. They're obviously desirable places to live when you look at housing prices skyrocketing. People do want to live in these areas, and just listening to them and understanding everyone, it can feel draining at times, but at the same time, I do find that exciting, is just engaging with the public and hearing all those different aspects. I can't really turn my head off when I go to Garden Suites. I go for runs regularly, and I will kind of start jogging in place as I stare into someone's backyard from the street, thinking like, could it fit there? How would it fit there? What's the impact? And I find that part really exciting. And I most look forward to is just seeing the designs and what could come out of this. Because I do love looking at kind of the nice renderings and seeing the end product, even with laneway suites, as I go down a laneway with my kids and they're complaining that we're stopping in the sun as I take pictures of a laneway suite under construction that I think looks really cool and I'd love to live in. So I think it's just seeing all the different aspects come together from people that want to live in them, the people that want to design them, and the neighborhoods that they're going to be in. I think it just all comes together to a really interesting project that laneway suites started off. And I think this pushes the next step in it and just is a great starting spot for the entire EHON initiative, which is it's fully underway, but I think this is just the first part that's starting to roll out and have the most kind of public attention at the moment. So I think that's really exciting overall.
Go ahead.
I was just saying, in terms of staying involved and just being engaged, I think the best thing is to ask questions, email us, give us a call. I don't always have time to answer every call right away, but I try to get it to everyone, get to every question. And we have a great team that works with us that is excited about the project. So the more questions and the more emails we get and calls, the more answers we can have, the more information we get on how people want to use these and what their concerns are. And then we can add you to our contact lists and make sure that you get contacted for future consultation or when the final report's going forward. And I think it's also getting the word out there. We talk to people that have laneway properties that have no idea that they could have a laneway suite already. Like, is this going to be allowed on laneway suite on properties backing onto laneways? Yes, that's already allowed. You can build that now. And the excitement that they find out when they already have that permission, we can try our best to get the word out there. But often it's individuals such as yourself, Craig, that do such a great job of getting the word out there even further and making sure that people just know that the project's happening. That's half the battle.
Are you trying to tell me that I can already build a garden suite in my backyard if I have a laneway and it's called a laneway suite? That's amazing.
It's fantastic. It is.
That's great.
So I think that's the big one. Engaging with us, calling us, and not feeling afraid to give us a call, because I think we're pretty friendly people and happy to talk to you, everyone.
Great. Yeah, there have been a lot of questions in the Q&A panel tonight that we have not answered, mostly because they're all very technical. So expect a flood of emails from most of the people listening tonight with questions about dormers and solar panels and emergency access and things that I'm sure will come to light soon. And this, I think, is a good point to conclude. Thanks so much, Graig, Allison, and David, for joining us tonight. And also thanks to all of your colleagues in the planning department for all of your hard work on this. We're really excited to see how our neighborhoods are changing and commend you for your work. And everyone listening, be sure to email David and Allison directly. Their emails are on the city's website. If you just Google Garden Suite Toronto, you'll find it. Also, we'll be posting opportunities to stay involved and broadcast public meetings on Lanescape social media, so follow that as well. And Lanescape also has a free property report service for laneway suites. We will be providing that for garden suites as soon as the policy is in place. So feel free to send us your email as well, and we'll catalog that and start sending out reports because we want to make sure that people are getting good, clean information. So thanks very much to the panelists and to everyone listening. We're excited for the future. Have a good night, everybody.
Thank you for having us.
Thanks, Craig. This has been great.
Bye-bye. This was fun. Bye-bye.